Hi, welcome to today's webinar. This is Urban Forestry Carbon Offset Protocol, developing projects through the Offset Network. The speakers for today's webinar are Matt Arsenault, who's the Program Manager of the Duke Carbon Offsets Initiative at Duke University, Emma Fulop, who's the Program Coordinator of the Duke Carbon Offsets Initiative, and myself. I'm Ruby Woodside, the Climate Program Senior Manager at Second Nature. Okay, so the protocol development pathway, what I'm going to show here are just the main steps for how that works, and then we'll hear some more details from Duke University, who recently put a protocol through this process. So if you're interested in developing a new type of carbon offset project and there's not a protocol that you're finding through some of the existing carbon standards, schools have the option to develop a new carbon offset protocol. So this would be the first step. And if a school is interested in doing that, I would say we definitely encourage you to reach out to myself or any other members of the peer review committee if you're thinking about doing this. Again, we can help you think through ideas, we can provide feedback and resources. We really want to foster a dialogue here among the academic community. So if you're interested in developing a new protocol, definitely reach out to members of the peer review committee and we can help you think through what that would look like. So from there, once a school has a protocol written, then you would submit it for review through the peer review committee. There, let's see, can we go back to? Great. So then the peer review committee will conduct due diligence and they'll identify at least 3 technical experts that are willing to review the protocol. Usually we ask for at least one of the experts to have experience in the protocol type and then at least one person to be an expert in carbon accounting. So from there, once there are these experts identified who are willing to review the protocol, then the peer review committee will facilitate the review. So what we're aiming for is to have 2 rounds of comments. So it would be comments and response from the technical experts and then the protocol developer. After those 2 rounds, if there are any unresolved comments, then the peer review committee will determine how they should be responded to, and they'll determine whether or not the protocol can be approved for use on the offset network. Once the protocol is approved, then we'll share it publicly. We'll post it online on the Offset Network website. Any school that's interested can then begin using this protocol to develop carbon offset projects. And I also want to mention that we have a public comment period available. So once the protocol is made available on the website, then anyone from the public can review it, and we do welcome comments that would help improve the robustness of these new protocols. And then the last thing I'll mention is that at least every 5 years, if not sooner, protocols should go through the review process again, just to make sure that they're up to date. So those are the main steps. You can see more detail on the offsetnetwork.org website. We also have a guidance document that covers everything that should be included in a protocol. And again, you can always email innovation@secondnature.org with any questions. And I'm actually going to stop here. We'll have lots of time for questions and discussion at the end, but I do want to turn it over to Duke to make sure we have time to hear from them how this actually worked in practice, and then to hear more about their urban forestry protocol. So take it away, Duke.
All right, give me 1 second to try to take control of the slides, and I'll get us started.
Great.
Maybe it's easier, Ruby. Could you just advance to the start of ours?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so as Ruby mentioned, I'm Matt Arsenault of the Duke Carbon Offsets Initiative, and we'll also hear from Emma Fulop, who is the other half of DCOI. Today, we basically want to talk about the urban forestry protocol that our office has developed. We will talk, some specifics about the protocol, and we'll also go into a little more detail in the offset network protocol review process that the protocol itself went through recently, It's the first example of this offset network process being used. We learned a lot from it and want to share our experience. And we'll end with an example of the protocol in use in a real-world project that we are in the middle of developing. So if you could go to the next slide, Ruby, and actually go 2 more ahead. I'm going to start off talking about the protocol specifically, and before I delve into the specifics, I want to give a little context. Why urban forestry? Why did we create this protocol? Emma and I actually inherited this protocol. It predates both of us at the Carbon Offsets Initiative. However, we have overseen some revisions and updates to the protocol, and we have shepherded it through this most recent offset network process. So part of the reasons that our predecessors made an urban forestry protocol is to address a gap that they saw in the voluntary carbon market, which I'll go into more detail on the next slide. They wanted to create a more accessible protocol. As many of you are probably familiar with, registry protocols can be filled with jargon and they can be long technical documents. So our predecessors wanted to make a protocol that was a little more easy to digest and more geared towards non-urban forestry experts. So think of university sustainability staff. An urban forestry protocol is a project type that allows for hyper-local projects, which is something that many universities, including Duke, are interested in. And urban forestry was and remains an area of great need. According to Forest Service research, we're losing something on the order of 4 million urban trees a year in the United States. And at the same time, we're seeing a pretty dramatic increase in paved surfaces in these urban areas. So to the extent that this protocol helps reverse that negative trend, we're happy to see more projects of this type. So if we can go to the next slide. So I mentioned the carbon market gap that our predecessors saw. On the left column in this graph, you'll see the 3 main domestic registries: the Climate Action Reserve, DERA, American Carbon Registry, and the Gold Standard. And then the right 4 columns are the different forestry project types. So the X indicates that that registry offered a protocol of that forestry project type at the time when our protocol was being developed. So as you can see, there's a lot of afforestation protocols available, a couple of voided conversion protocols, but only the Climate Action Reserve offered an urban forestry protocol. So our predecessors saw a lack of choice in the voluntary carbon market, and they thought the market and universities specifically would benefit from having a little more choice and being able to shop around protocols and choose what fits best for them. So now I'll start looking into the specifics of our protocol. The eligibility conditions of our protocol are based largely on the Climate Action Reserve, as are several sections of our protocol based off of CAR's protocol. Something different from CAR's protocol is I believe they require a 100-year commitment for the project. That's the minimum time that you're going to have to be actively monitoring the trees. Our protocol requires a 40-year commitment. We're trying to walk a line of having robust permanence requirements while making the commitment a little more manageable for universities and cities or whoever they might partner with. Some added flexibility that has been injected into the protocol is the ability to adjust eligibility requirements on a case-by-case basis. So to take advantage of this, you would want to petition the offset network, basically making your case as to why your project can still be a legitimate, robust project, even though it might not meet every eligibility requirement to a T. There's no guarantee that it would be approved, but we at least give the opportunity to sort of make your case. Baseline and additionality in the protocol. So we use a national baseline of urban tree canopy cover declining. As I mentioned, this is based largely on Forest Service research that shows this national trend. This is sort of the backdrop for our protocol. However, I will go into specific additionality on the next slide where we zoom in specifically to your project to ensure that those specific trees you're going to be planting are actually additional and would not have been planted in the business as usual scenario. Additionally, added flexibility in our protocol is the option to use the Climate Action Reserve performance standard if you find that that fits best for your project. So additionality, our protocol has what we call the additionality checklist. This is a series of categories that have questions or sort of fill in the blank narrative sections where you're making your additionality case for your project. So the first category is historical data. We ask you to provide historic planting budget data of your tree planting partner. So for example, we typically work with cities, the city of Durham, for example. We have access to how much money they've spent over the previous few years on planting trees specifically. Similarly, the protocol asks for historic number of trees planted. So both of these will sort of set a trend and give any verifiers the ability to see what the previous case was and what historic levels of tree funding and tree planting levels were, and it gives them the ability to measure the impact that your project has had on those baselines. Next is regulatory requirements. So this is asking basically, are there any laws or regulations that require a certain number of trees to be planted in your project area? The answer is typically no, but if the answer is yes, that doesn't preclude you from developing a project, but you will have to demonstrate that your project represents going above and beyond what is legally required as far as numbers of trees planted. Implementation barriers, these can be budgetary, staffing capacity, or other barriers to additional trees being planted. So an example here is if you're working with a city that has a limited budget to plant trees, and the funding you're providing allows them to exceed their budget levels and plant more trees with the access to additional funding, that would be just a quick example of lowering a budgetary barrier to allow more trees to be planted. So in addressing this additionality checklist, you're going to identify each of these barriers and then go into a good amount of detail describing how your project specifically represents the lowering of these barriers. And then finally, in the additionality checklist is a clause that basically says your planting partner will not take the funding that you're providing them and simply move their budget around to increase funding elsewhere. So for example, if you're giving them $10,000 to plant trees, they won't simply reduce their planting budget by $10,000 and increase their equipment budget by that amount. And that's actually a specific clause that's required in your contract with them. It's required by the protocol. So next we're going to go into the paver requirements. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the paver requirements. These are basically a tool to help us identify high quality offsets. So permanence, additionality, verifiable, enforceable, and real emission reductions. Our protocol addresses permanence basically by requiring a management plan. So your planting partner has to have an established management plan to ensure the longevity and continued health of the trees so that the carbon they sequester remains in the trees. Also, we use a buffer pool that I'll go into more detail on in a few slides. But basically, these are two ways to ensure that the trees are living for as long as possible and sequestering carbon for as long as they can. I went over additionality with the additionality checklist. That's the main tool that the protocol used to ensure that trees are additional, in addition to the national baseline of declining urban canopy cover. In verifiable, we basically ask that you collect a lot of data on your trees. This is done usually through a full inventory of the trees after they're planted and then every 5 years. In addition to collecting all of this data, of course, your project will be verified by a third party or a peer university. And as is usually the case for carbon offset projects, to generate offsets, your project must be verified by a third party. Enforceable, a big part here is ensuring that the credits generating from your project are not double counted. So the protocol requires that you have a written agreement with your partner that establishes ownership of the credits. And if there's a split of the credits, for example, if you're splitting the credits generated 50-50, that needs to be documented in writing too, and something that's able to be shared with your validators and verifiers. And finally, real, you're collecting a lot of data on the trees that you plant. The extent that you can make that transparent, publicly available, helps ensure that folks know that this is a real project resulting in real trees being planted. The protocol addresses risk mitigation in a couple of ways. I mentioned the buffer pool. The buffer pool is sort of like a self-insurance mechanism. So when your project is verified as early as year 5, you're going to generate carbon offsets. However, you won't get 100% of those offsets with our protocol because it requires that you donate 50% of them to a buffer pool. This buffer pool is then used to address any reversals. So if a tree is hit by a truck, or if there's a fire, or whatever might cause the carbon in your project trees to be lost, you are covered by at least up to 15% of your total project by the credits that you've put away into this buffer pool. We also have a mechanism to allow for projects to be discontinued. We hope this is not used too much, but it is a flexible option built into our protocol. So if for whatever reason, let's say in year 10 of the project, maybe there's staff turnover or whatever the case is, and one of the partners decides that they can no longer continue monitoring the trees and ensuring the health of the trees, they may elect to discontinue the project, but it will cost them. So basically the protocol requires whoever decides to discontinue the project to purchase and retire third-party verified carbon offsets in the amount of the carbon that all of your project trees would have sequestered over the life of the 40-year project. So you're basically buying your way out of the project through a purchase of carbon offsets. For added flexibility, we have put in a clause that says you can petition the offset network to reduce this requirement by 25% if you can provide evidence that shows that the trees will still be maintained somehow. So monitoring in the protocol, on the right side of this slide, we have a schedule of monitoring. There are 2 main monitoring events that the protocol requires. The first is full inventories. The first full inventory is required within a year of your project being completed. And then it's on a rolling 5-year schedule, which corresponds with verification events. So a full inventory is a very rigorous accounting of all of your project trees. We require the location in terms of GPS coordinates for every tree, species of every tree, EPH height and health status of every tree. Of course, you can collect more information, but that's the bare minimum that the protocol requires. The other monitoring event is annual monitoring, which is a less robust version of the full inventories. This is basically a mechanism to force the project operator to keep an eye on their trees, be aware of any issues that might be going on in their trees. And as I mentioned, it's less robust than full inventories. This is a simple sort of spot check on trees. You're basically just looking for, are the trees still there and what's their health status? Protocol verification. There's 2 types of verification similar to most other carbon offset projects. There's the initial validation, and then there's actual protocol verification. The validation must occur within the first year of your project being completed. This is the initial assessment of your project. It includes a site visit by the validator, a count of the trees, verification that the trees are where you say they are and that the quantity of trees matches what's in your PDD. And reviewing all of the contracts and required clauses between you and your partners in the project. Verification starts in year 5 and then occurs every 5 years. Again, it's a site visit, verifying that trees are where they're supposed to be, verifying their health status, reviewing monitoring reports, and finally calculating offset generation. So you'll see the asterisks on year 5's verification. This is another element of flexibility built into our protocol. Because many of us are planting smaller trees, they may not grow enough to sequester very much carbon by year 5, and some universities may decide that it's not worth the effort to verify trees that are only 5 or 6 years old and haven't sequestered very much carbon. So verification can be deferred until year 20, which is the end of the first project period. So 20 years, trees are going to have sequestered a lot more carbon, and then it may be worth the logistical and financial cost potentially of verification at that point. There's no penalty for doing this other than, your project won't generate credits for 20 years. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the protocol itself. Now I'm going to hand it over to Emma to talk a little more about our experience going through the offset network protocol review process.
Great, thanks, Matt. So one moment. Great. So to begin the protocol review process, as protocol developers, we were responsible for identifying experts in both carbon offsets and urban forestry who would be willing to critique the protocol. And so we specifically wanted to find people in higher education who work with carbon offsets, as well as foresters who focus on the urban environment. So the names you see listed on the screen are the individuals who agreed to participate in the process. And we submitted all 6 of these names to the peer review committee so that they could finally make an official selection of 3 reviewers. So the names in bold, Dr. Ralph Bradford, Dr. Eric Wiseman, and Dr. Christopher Edgar were the 3 reviewers officially selected to review the protocol. So once the reviewers were informed that they were selected, we began the actual review process. So we decided that all communication should go through the offset network via Ruby rather than directly between DCOI and the reviewers to create some space for the reviewers to be critical and to hopefully reduce any bias in the responses. So Ruby shared our protocol with the reviewers, and once we received the round 1 review comments, we compiled all of these responses into one document. So we did this for ease of editing, but also so that the reviewers could see what their peers suggested when they went back to do the round 2 review. In the document we sent back, we accepted some edits, but we also responded to comments and left explanations within the document to create some level of conversation throughout this review process. So then we received round 2 review responses, which were much more focused than round 1, with reviewers really concentrating on either points that we initially chose not to include or responding to our edits and explanations. So at the end of this process, we had a finalized protocol, except for 3 larger overarching comments and points of difference between us and the reviewers, which we brought to the peer review committee. So again, the peer review committee has final say in all edits before the protocol is deemed completed. And we especially wanted their insight on 3 points, which were, the first one was a discussion about the language applicability and the baseline. So one of the reviewers suggested using tree planting trends rather than using levels when determining the baseline. And we brought this comment to the peer review committee because it was a little bit outside of our wheelhouse, since Matt and I are not foresters. And so we were really looking for clarification from other scientists on the peer review committee. Based on their thoughts, we decided to change the language to use trends instead of levels, as was suggested. There was also discussion about if the protocol should include incentives to allow for creativity and planning for a changing climate when selecting trees and tree planting locations. So we saw the value in this, but we didn't want to make it a major part of the protocol, since the focus really is on carbon offset generation. The peer review committee suggested that we include language about the value of this knowledge generation without including an incentive structure. Finally, we had some questions about the use of state level tree data versus national data when deciding project eligibility. The peer review committee decided that the national trend is appropriate, since this trend isn't used when determining credit amounts, but it's simply used to see if a project is eligible to use the protocol. However, we included some flexibility in allowing developers to have the option to use state level data. So overall, the peer review committee was really useful in providing this outside perspective to these larger issues and kind of officially finalizing the protocol for us. So we learned a lot about our protocol and review etiquette while going through this process. So we wanted to highlight some overarching lessons that we really learned. So the first one is, during this process, we had to really think critically about the carbon offset familiarity of potential users and reviewers. Since 2 of our expert reviewers work in forestry rather than carbon offset space, this expertise inevitably impacted how they were able to interact with the protocol and what they called out. And so this difference in expertise was really helpful in getting us to look at the protocol from a different perspective than we usually do and rethink how we approach and explain offset tenets that we had previously thought were clear, like how we explain the permanence of a tree planting project. And when we started this project, we knew that we wanted to create a sense of conversation among ourselves and the reviewers while still maintaining some distance. So like I said earlier, we did this by utilizing the comments function during the review process in a Word document. However, looking back, we realized that we may have benefited from directly talking to a reviewer about specific questions, as this would have allowed for more of a back and forth and a possible resolution rather than is possible in a two-stage review process. Lastly, we went into this process with a pretty clear timeline in our minds that it would take about 2 or 3 weeks for each of the review rounds. However, we quickly learned that this was not enough time to fully engage with all of the comments and make substantive changes while keeping in mind everyone's busy schedules. So future protocol developers and reviewers should be aware this process can take longer than estimated. We also want to make sure that we thank our expert reviewers for offering their time and insight and for being gracious as we worked through this protocol review for the first time.
Great, so that was a quick overview of the Offset Network protocol review process that we experienced for the first time. And now we're going to talk about an example of the protocol's use in practice. So the example that we are going to be talking through is a recent project that, as I mentioned, we are in the process of developing now. The trees are in the ground. They were planted in February of this year. And this project is, again, a partnership between our office, DCOI, the City of Durham, and Keep Durham Beautiful. We planted roughly 420 trees through this process. Before we talk about this project really specifically, I just wanted to give a quick overview of how we see the project development process for urban forestry projects. So there's a few different phases that we use to frame developing these projects, beginning with project design, moving into the actual planting, then of course validation and verification. So project design is sort of everything that happens before the trees are put in the ground. And this is, I urge folks to spend a lot of time and effort in these early phases when you're actually designing the project. A well-designed project, in my experience, goes much more smoothly than something that you just sort of go into without the necessary thought and conversations beforehand. So in this project design phase, you're going to work with, well, first you're going to identify the partners that you're going to be developing the project with. You're going to discuss all of the required clauses that go in a contract. You're going to discuss how funding is going to work. You're going to discuss who gets the offsets once they're generated. And at this point, you're also going to complete your project plan document, the template of which is available on offsetnetwork.org. This is a great way to sort of enshrine all those conversations that you've been having with your partners to make sure everyone is on the same page. Then you're going to move into the actual doing of the project, the planting phase. You're probably going to lean on your planting partner for a lot of this expertise and equipment to actually get the trees in the ground. While you're doing this, you're going to want to make sure you're recording all of the data, tree GPS location, species, size, etc., because you're going to need it for the full inventory that will need to be created within the first year after the planting is, or sorry, within the first 12 weeks after the planting is done. During this period and right after the planting is actually completed, you're going to want to complete your project description document. Again, a template of that is available on offsetnetwork.org. During the planting phase, you're probably going to want to start your search for a validator because that is going to be required within the first year after the planting is completed. Once you've identified a validator, you're going to provide them with the PDD, the full inventory, and any other data that they might need to evaluate your project. It's going to sound like a broken record, but you can also refer them to offsetnetwork.org for a validation template as well as other guidance. And you're also going to want to be looking towards the future for your verification, especially if that's something you're going to want to complete in year 5. It's never too early to start conversations with potential verifiers and get that in the works. Eventually, you'll have to provide them with all of your monitoring reports and other data that they might need to perform a full verification. And again, you can point them to Offset Network for the verification template as well as other guidance. So for our project specifically, we had the benefit of working with partners that we have a long relationship with, being the City of Durham and Keep Durham Beautiful. So the project design phase of our project went, relatively smoothly. These are conversations that we've had with these same people before. If you're having these conversations for the first time, I imagine they'll take longer for everyone to get comfortable with what an urban forestry project looks like or how a carbon offset project in general is developed. But we didn't have those issues as we've developed projects with these folks before. We did have conversations about the number of trees that we would be supporting, how funding would flow, logistics for getting the trees in the ground, and just making sure all of our I's were dotted and T's were crossed as far as the necessary clauses in our contract and clearly laying out in our contract who is responsible for what. So just as a quick example, there's a little snapshot. That picture on the right is actually from our contract with the City of Durham. You can see there's a quick about the project section. There's also towards the bottom of the page, the beginning of the section that lays out the responsibilities of each party. So in this stage, we wanted to complete our project plan document so everyone, again, can be on the same page as far as what the project is going to look like and enshrining everything that we had discussed in the project design phase.
So our partners, Keep Durham Beautiful and the City of Durham, are our tree planting experts, and they're incredibly valuable in the planning and the success of this project. They were in charge of most of the aspects of the planting, from selecting tree species to finding the planting locations and recording and storing GPS locations and data for each tree. They also ended up planting all of our project trees. Ideally, we would have planted some subset of these trees during a community work day, but the timing didn't quite line up for this project. So we instead planted some other trees for the City of Durham during a work day that we sponsored. So now that the project trees are in the ground, it's DCOI's responsibility to complete the project description document, which again includes information about where the trees were planted, how we met protocol requirements, and other information required for verification and validation.
And so now we are currently in the midst of validation. So for validation, we are, of course, going through the Offset Network and working with a peer validator. In this case, it's Elon University, which is less than an hour away from Duke. Working with the validator, as I said, we've already got one identified, and we are in the process of handing over to them all of the data that they will need to complete the validation. Some of the data you can see in the screenshot, that's actually a screenshot of our full tree inventory. It's a sizable spreadsheet, but as you can see, it's got all of the GPS coordinates and a relative address for the trees. It has a city assigned planting site ID as well as the species and a lot of other information that didn't fit in one screenshot. So it's a plant ecologist and a student researcher performing this validation for us. And we're looking forward to a site visit that will occur later this summer where they'll be coming to Durham and physically laying eyes on our trees and completing the validation. Then in the future, we will be looking for a peer verifier of this project. And so we will hand over to them, again, the PDD and any other information that they might need to complete the verification. Of course, that'll be at least 5 years from now before we pursue verification, but we do look forward to the day when these trees start generating offsets for the university. So that was just a quick look at an example of use of the protocol that we've been discussing, but that concludes our section of the presentation. So I think I'll hand it back over to Ruby so we can take a look at the questions that you might have.
Great, thank you, Matt and Emma. And thanks to everyone for joining as well. So we do have some time for questions. Folks can go ahead and enter any questions you have through the chat box, and we'll try to get to all of them. If you have questions that we don't get to, we can follow up over email as well. So just to get started, looks like a question for Matt and Emma, I think, since you have both done a lot of urban forestry projects, but how large are typical urban forestry projects and how many credits are usually generated?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have seen you know, a range of project sizes from double-digit, very small pilot scale, sort of testing the concept and testing out the project size projects, up to around 1,000 trees being planted in one project. I'm going to give a bit of a cop-out answer on the amount of credits that they can produce, because we actually haven't verified a project yet, because it hasn't been more than 5 years since we've developed our first one. But we live in the real world where urban forestry is not a huge volume producer of carbon offsets. A lot of its benefit lies in the co-benefits that the project represents, which is it's a hugely high co-benefit project type. So the ability to get students out to actually plant the trees and connect with their community, all of the environmental co-benefits that trees in urban areas represent, just a great project type overall. However, it's not the best when it comes to generating a lot of carbon offsets. But we are excited to generate, even if it's a small number, we are excited to see how much those will yield for us.
Great. And here's another question for you two at Duke. So do you have an estimate for the total cost of planting and then also maintaining a tree for the lifetime, so 40 years? And then as a follow-up, did Duke pay for all of that, or was it split between the different partners?
Yeah, so in our projects with the city of Durham, at least, we generally pay the full upfront cost of purchasing the tree. And the cost of purchasing a tree is very dependent on what type or size of tree we're talking about. So a bare root tree, the smallest type that would be planted, there's even a range within that type of tree, but you can expect to pay maybe between $40 and $60 per tree of that type and size. And then if we're talking about a ball and burlap tree, which is usually a bit larger, those are going to be more expensive, maybe something on the $75 to $110 range. And luckily, the city of Durham, who we typically work with, they have robust budget for maintenance. They have staff for maintenance, all the equipment necessary. And so as they're taking care of their sort of city trees that we haven't funded, they also just do the maintenance on our trees as well. It's not that the trees we support are Duke-only trees. They're still planted on city right-of-way, city-owned land. So they cover the cost of maintenance for us. If we're very lucky, we will only have to pay the upfront cost of trees. However, 40 years is a long time, and a lot can happen to these urban trees, especially those along streets. So we may have to replace trees here and there. Hopefully not too many of those cases.
Great. And just a bit of a follow-up question about the funding. So for this particular project that you talked about, are the Elon verifiers, are they paid for this at all? And if so, who pays for the cost of them? And who actually trains them to do the verification?
Yeah, so this is one of the many benefits associated with using Offset Network to do peer verification as opposed to third-party verification. If we were looking at a standard registry third-party verification, we'd be paying thousands and thousands of dollars to validate or verify what is, in actuality, a pretty small project. Through Offset Network, the highest cost we've ever had to pay for peer verification is the travel expenses associated with the site visit. So we haven't, at least in the past, paid directly for verification services for peer verification. Certainly something we would consider. But yeah, it's a really inexpensive way to validate a project and then to eventually generate credits if you're just paying for a rental car and a couple of hotel nights, that's a pittance compared to, like I said, the thousands of dollars we would be paying for traditional registry verification.
Yeah, and I'll just jump on and talk a little bit more about that as well. So typically it's up to the school that has the project and the school that's going to be providing the verification to determine, who's going to pay for any travel costs. I'm not aware of any schools that have actually paid directly for the verification. In every case that I know of, at least, sometimes the school with the project has covered the travel cost, as Matt was mentioning. Or in some cases, the school that's doing the verification, they really see value in it for their students. So they'll cover the travel costs for the team to go and actually do a site visit. So it really depends on, figuring out what's going to work between the two parties there. And as far as training the verifiers, I will say, as I mentioned beginning when I had no slides, which I apologize for. So the verifier is usually, the lead verifier is usually a faculty or staff member at a university who does have experience in carbon offsets and carbon offset accounting and the project type. And so they'll train the students and supervise the students that are actually involved in the verification. If someone is interested in being a verifier who maybe has some experience but not a lot and needs more support, then members of the peer review committee are definitely able to help kind of work through the verification process and provide some level of training to the person who's going to be the lead verifier so that they understand, what needs to be included in the verification, what questions should be asked and everything. So, yeah. Let's see. Other questions? So we have a question about, is there a web platform where all projects enlisted will be presented? And where would a registry be for potential offset trading? So yes, the offset network, the website currently serves as the platform where all projects are listed. So if you visit the offsetnetwork.org, you can see all the projects that have either been developed or that are in the pipeline right now. And if they have any credits that have been issued, most of them on their earlier stages, and some have gone through validation but haven't necessarily gone through verification yet. As far as a registry for potential offset trading, so one thing I do want to clarify for these types of offsets is because they go through peer verification, we call them peer-reviewed projects or peer-reviewed offsets, and they don't necessarily go through the traditional third-party ISO accredited verification process. The idea is that these credits should not be traded. They shouldn't be marketed, bought, or sold. They're really only for the use by the university that is developing the project. So the university that's developing the project can use the offsets to, they can apply them to their own greenhouse gas emissions inventory. However, they can't be traded or sold. Let's see, another question for Duke. Could you talk a little bit more about how Duke is funding this program? So maybe where within the institution the funding is coming from, and also as part of that, kind of what case you made for administration, or was it difficult to get support for this, or was this, is this something that the leadership is really on board with? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Duke is maybe a unique case in that, we have at Duke University an office with 2 full-time salaried staff dedicated to carbon offsets specifically, which I think is still pretty rare within higher ed. So we do have a level of support from higher up in the university that we're really appreciative of. So we actually have, an annual budget at DCOI to develop projects and purchase offsets. It's a humble budget, I would say. We're not developing commercial scale projects, but we certainly have the ability to do pilot scale projects and demonstration projects that we hope someday soon will scale up and really start generating offsets for the university. The university is also aware that we're going to have to purchase larger volumes of carbon offsets in the coming years. So we are exploring what sustainable funding mechanisms exist within higher ed. So we're looking at things like air travel fees that we might institute within university air travel. There's other things sort of being reviewed right now, but everything's on the table. Maybe it's a parking fee to offset some employee commuting related offsets. Maybe it's a fee in department energy budgets that will help us fund further development of offset projects or offset purchases. So yeah, I think Duke is probably unique when it comes to offset funding, just given that DCOI has existed for coming up on 10 years. But yeah, in the discussions we have with other universities, they're increasingly interested in offsets as they get closer to sustainability targets that they've set. And I think everyone's trying to figure out, how do we pay for these things except for just going to administration on an annual basis. Of course, you want it to be sustainable funding, and I don't think anyone has found a single answer yet, but there's certainly been success with some of the funding mechanisms that I've mentioned.
Yeah, and I think what we're hearing from schools is that where they're seeing a lot of value in developing these types of local projects is the co-benefits that come along with this. So having the direct community partnership, having student involvement, having different faculty involvement, it's the benefits are much more than just reducing the carbon emissions of the institution. And so that seems to be a really strong case for schools that are developing these types of projects for them to be able to move forward. So I think we'll have time for one more quick question, and this looks like a question about the urban forestry protocol. Could you give an example of eligibility and what the barriers might be?
Sure. So eligibility from the protocol is, there's several aspects that the protocol requires. So project location is one of the criteria under the eligibility conditions. So the project must be located within officially defined urban area as defined by the Census Bureau. So that's one option. Another option is that the project area must be within an incorporated city or town as designated by the laws of that state. And I think the final option is it can be in an unincorporated city or town as long as it's designated as an unincorporated city or town by the state. The next is project area, if I'm remembering correctly. So it has to be, basically you have to define what the project area is and document that with sort of a GIS file. And then project commencement has to do with the timing of the project. And so the protocol requires you to sort of define when your project actually starts, and then you've got 6 months to sort of submit your project to the registry, in most cases, hopefully offset network. So I think those are some of the main eligibility conditions. The only ones I can imagine folks having a difficult time with are the locations. If you don't fall into one of those specific categories, that's the only example I can think of where if you're not in one of those defined areas, you might want to petition the offset network to say, hey, I think I've got a legitimate project planned, but I don't meet one of these definitions. Can I still do the project?
Great, thank you. All right, so we're at the end of the hour, so we'll just wrap it up. I want to say, thank you to our presenters, Matt and Emma. Thank you to all the attendees.